Rockin' Politics, where politics always rocks. You've just been rocked by Rockin' Politics.
I'm your host, Hillary Raimo. In 2014, Vermont became the first state to require mandatory GMO labeling. Connecticut and Maine have also passed GMO labeling laws that will go into effect once neighboring states pass similar laws, and other states are currently looking to pass GMO labeling legislation. In response to these state efforts, Representatives Mike Pomino, a representative from Kansas, and G.K. Butterfield from North Carolina, introduced federal legislation developed by food companies that we in the consumer rights community have dubbed the Deny Americans the Right to Know Act, otherwise known as the DARK Act. This anti-GMO labeling bill passed the House of Representatives in 2015, and Senator Roberts introduced similar legislation in 2016 that was defeated this past March 16th, which is a really great win for us consumers. This is not the end of the fight, and we need to continue pressing for mandatory GMO labeling on the package. And we've come pretty far. So we're here today to talk about the DARK Act with my guest, Colin O'Neal, a member of the Environmental Working Group known as EWG. He is the Agricultural Policy Director on a wide variety of matters related to food and farm policy. He regularly meets with members of Congress and their staffs on agricultural policy issues, including crop insurance, farm subsidies, conservation programs, and food labeling. So we have a lot to talk about. We have a great program, and I'm really excited. Thanks, Colin, for being here.
Thanks. Welcome. It's my pleasure.
So how did you get started into this topic? What was it that drew you into this movement?
Well, I have had the good fortune of working on this really critical issue for nearly 8 years now. Prior to joining the Environmental Working Group, I worked for a similar environmental nonprofit called the Center for Food Safety, which has also been leading the charge on GMO labeling and other critical food and ag issues. And really, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is one of the, if not the most important food policy matter to consumers today. And no matter who you poll, 9 out of 10 Americans want the right to know what's in their food and how their food is produced, the same right that 64 other countries around the world give their consumers. And yes, as you mentioned, it's been a big week for GMO labeling and for consumers around the country.
Now, when you heard that this legislation had been defeated, was it kind of like an elated moment for you? Was it like all the work that you have done and the organization that you work for has actually moved forward, positively towards something that we can celebrate as an act of knowing and, moving in the right direction for consumers in the United States? Were you excited? I guess that's what I'm trying to ask. Was this a win?
As someone among many great folks here in Washington, D.C. who've been working on this issue for many, many years, we're overly cautious to, congratulate ourselves or anyone too soon because, it's been very clear that the major food and chemical companies that you referenced earlier have spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the past couple years to keep American consumers in the dark. They've spent that money to oppose ballot initiatives at the state level, to lobby state lawmakers, and increasingly spending over $100 million here in Washington, D.C. to lobby members of Congress to oppose GMO labeling and, in fact, preempt state and federal ability to label GMOs. So we know that a number of these companies will stop at nothing to keep American consumers in the dark, and we think it's important to continue to press this issue. But I think there is a silver lining, and we're starting to see the cracks form around the edges. One of the biggest trade associations, the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which represents most of the major food producers and food companies in the U.S., has been really leading the charge to oppose GMO labeling. But in the past week, 4 major food companies, ConAgra, Kellogg's, General Mills, and Mars, have have all announced that they will begin to label food products that contain genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. These companies joined Campbell's Soup, which declared its intent to label GMOs back in January. So, this news coming 1 week after labeling supporters in the Senate defeated the latest attempt at the Dark Act is really a positive signal of I think, what we can expect to come in the future.
Yeah. Well, we have work to do, and so this win is something that we need to honor and celebrate, but also we need to look forward to the coming days and months and years even, because this issue isn't going to go away too soon, is it? This is something that Americans have really been pushing to not only have, but the resistance from the food industry has been extremely high. What is it, in your opinion, professionally and personal, that you believe keeps the food industry from labeling the GMOs? What is the big struggle, if you could limit it to, one or two things?
Well, that's a great question, and actually something that we've asked most of these food companies, both publicly and privately. And frankly, I have never been given a great reason for why food companies have objected so wholeheartedly as they have. A couple of the big myths that we hear most often spread by the food industry or members of the food industry are that if there's mandatory GMO labeling, that somehow changing labels is going to cause food prices to skyrocket. But in actuality, we know that food companies change their labels all the time without passing on the cost to the consumer, and that most food companies don't print labels more than 1 or 2 years in advance because, hey, if you're a company that produces cereal or a Wheaties box, you know that someone's going to win the Super Bowl next year, and you're going to have to change your packaging to update that. So, we know that companies can include new information like mandatory GMO labeling within that refresh cycle. So, that argument has never really made sense to me. But I think that you raise a great point, which is that this defeat of the Dark Act actually gives Congress a really great opportunity to craft a national mandatory GMO labeling standard that we feel could work for both consumers as well as the food industry. And we think there's a lot of great reason to do that.
Do you think that part of the problem might be the health risks that perhaps for, liability reasons might come back onto the food industry? Because we really haven't done enough studies. Well, I take that back. There have been studies done that GMO, organisms cause, different types of, growth issues, health issues. Those studies have been pretty available to other countries, and that's what pretty much moved them to ban GMOs in the 64 countries around the world. And the United States doesn't seem to be really willing to offer that scientific studies up to the consumers so that we can be transparent in understanding how these GMOs affect the human body. So do you feel that maybe perhaps this might be a liability issue? They don't want to make GMOs, a constant staple in the food supply and then have it come back and show that perhaps it causes certain health issues, then we're talking about massive lawsuits. So could this be a simple question of liability on the food industry? What do you think? I know you don't like to talk about it, but I'm just wondering what you think about that.
No, and I think that it's a really important question to be asked, and frankly should be part of the conversation going forward. But we've very purposely drawn the line in the sand to say, look, we don't label dangerous foods in this country. We take dangerous foods off the shelf. And right now, I think that frankly most of the science and data on the long-term human health of consuming GMOs, frankly, either hasn't been conducted or remains shrouded behind confidential business information and is kept private by the manufacturers. We think that while the jury is out, so to speak, that consumers should be able to pick and choose what they see fit for them and their families. Now, while the long-term human health impacts of consuming GMOs may not fully be known, we do know the unfortunate impact of producing GMOs, which is an overwhelming amount of herbicides being sprayed on American farmland and increasingly winding up on our food products. And that's just one of the many reasons that the 9 out of 10 Americans want the right to know when it comes to GMOs in their food.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So for those listening who may not be familiar with GMO, could you talk a little bit about what it is and how the crops differ from non-GMO crops?
Sure. So, genetic modification or genetic engineering most often entails taking genes from one or more organisms and splicing it into the genetic makeup of another. The vast majority of genetically engineered crops that are on the marketplace have been engineered to withstand exposure to herbicides. So an herbicide is a type of pesticide that's designed to kill weeds or other plants. And the most popular weed killer, Roundup, manufactured by Monsanto, which many people probably use in their backyards, is actually the herbicide that most of these genetically engineered crops have been engineered to withstand exposure to. So, prior to introduction of GMOs, most farmers couldn't spray a weed killer directly over their entire field because that would kill the weeds, but it would also kill their crop. Now that we've engineered crops to withstand exposure to herbicides, farmers can spray more and more weed killer on their entire crop to kill the weeds without damaging their crop. So whether it's corn or soybeans or cotton, we've seen farmers really adopt this new technology. But unfortunately, just like bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics, we've seen species of weeds develop resistance to herbicides. And now we have somewhere between 60 to 70 million acres of farmland in the U.S. that's infested with Roundup-resistant weeds, namely weeds that can't be killed by the herbicide Roundup and the active ingredient glyphosate. That means farmers have to spray more and more toxic herbicides, and I should note that glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, has already been connected as a probable human carcinogen by the International Cancer Research Arm of the World Health Organization. So, this is a major human health impact and also causes a lot of damage on the environment as well.
So we're not only talking about genetically modified food itself, but we're talking about an increase in herbicides and pesticides used to treat those altered crops. So it's kind of like a double whammy, wouldn't you say, for people who kind of don't really maybe not understand it but aren't too sure. So we're talking about genetically modified food on top of the extra use of pesticides and herbicides.
Yeah, exactly.
Correct?
And, I think most people would assume that genetic engineering has allowed farmers to plant more drought-tolerant corn or, produce greater yields on a smaller acre of land. But, in actuality, most, if not all of those benefits have actually been realized through conventional breeding, meaning the type of agricultural breeding that we've been doing since the dawn of agriculture, which is finding the best types of crops and reproducing them to produce more, to be better adapted to local environments, to tolerate stress. So we can really achieve all of those things through conventional breeding, and in many cases do it far cheaper and faster than using high-tech gimmicks like genetic engineering. Unfortunately, what genetic engineering in agriculture has done is it has created what we refer to as a pesticide treadmill, which is that farmers get hooked on these herbicide-resistant GMOs, and once you have a weed problem, the only recourse within this chemical industry handbook is the greater use of toxic herbicides.
It just makes me roll my eyes. I'm sitting here listening to you, and it just makes me take a deep breath and really, try to understand this. So for the ordinary, everyday citizen who goes to the grocery store and picks out their fruits and vegetables, now this doesn't just, relate to produce. It also relates to, like, salmon, where they've learned to genetically modify living meat. Now, how do you see that? We talked about the crops, we've talked about the pesticides, but when you talk about food like living fish or living animals, where do you see that going when you look at that topic and you listen to it, knowing everything you know in all the areas that you work in with the EWG? How do you feel from your gut when you look at stories like that about, scientists going in and manipulating the DNA and the genetic structure of living animals that we consume?
Well, I think it's important to remember within these dialogues that, technology itself is value neutral, that there can be positive and negative repercussions from the use of certain technologies. But most often, the applications of biotechnology and genetic engineering have really been used to better fit, whether it's livestock or fish farming or conventional plant farming, into an industrial agricultural system. So that's the lens through which biotechnology has really been applied to agriculture. And in the case of salmon, what this company Aqua Advantage has done, or Aqua Bounty has done, is try to genetically engineer a salmon to grow twice as fast as it normally would. Unfortunately, that has raised some potential allergy concerns by some of the scientific community. I know that many have raised concerns about what happens if these genetically engineered frankenfish, as they're referred to, could be released in the wild, how they could interact or in many cases outcompete wild salmon for fish or mates. And also, what this means for the health of the animals themselves, since they themselves are growing at twice the rate that they normally would. I know that many, especially those at the Consumers Union, have raised issues about what this means for animal welfare and the health of the salmon itself. So, I think these are all really important issues, and we, EWG, have always tried to provide information that is more easily digestible than what I've been talking about to the consumer, because we know that every day mom and dad have so many decisions, so many things that are going through their mind, and that really having access to and being able to find healthy, affordable food shouldn't be the top of on our list. But unfortunately for many folks, it has to be, given what we've been talking about. So I'd certainly urge your listeners to go to the Environmental Working Group's website, ewg.org, and check out our Dirty Dozen guide to pesticides on produce, so you can learn about which fruits and vegetables are more likely to have toxic pesticides on them. We've got a bunch of guides that really dumb this down and provide easily accessible information so that navigating the supermarket doesn't have to be so scary.
You guys really do a great job going to the website and getting ready for the show. It was very easy to navigate. You had a lot of great articles for people to go through. So you have a lot of really great, easy material on there that anybody can understand. You don't have to be a scientist or, go into that. But it's great. And I'm really excited to see organizations like yours come up and do this kind of work, because I really think that this is going to be one of the deciding topics of our generation. We're really going to see this bloom into a topic that, we don't really know where it's going, and we don't really have the statistics and the numbers to really say what's going to happen to the human species as we consume, tampered with food and so on and so forth. And these pesticides have been known to cause health problems. And so, like your ad says on your website, we don't really want to wait 5-10 years to test the chemicals that our children are consuming now because of government red tape. So that said, how do you see this moving forward? What's your vision of the GMO topic? How do you see people becoming more educated? Where are we going in the future? Where does EWG see us going, and where do you see us going?
Well, I think that a lot of this begins with transparency. And first and foremost, consumers, policymakers, and regulators should have the information at their fingertips to make the best decisions. So whether that's mom shopping in a supermarket or an FDA scientist trying to examine whether or not a new genetically engineered crop could cause an allergy risk, we think that there has to be the information out there. And actually, with that said, EWG developed and released recently a new app called Food Scores, which rates more than 80,000 foods in a really simple and searchable online format to provide consumers with some of that information. Because, as you say, you shouldn't have to be a scientist to be able to decipher what foods are good and bad for yourself or your family. So, we think a lot of that comes down to information, and we've got a great team of researchers and scientists who have really gone to the edge of the world and back to categorize all of these foods and translate it for average consumers. And then, on the back end, we also believe that we need to be educating policymakers that in many cases our regulatory environment and our legal framework for regulating foods is really outdated, and we're using 20th century regulations to regulate, in many cases, 21st century technologies. And we think it's high time that Congress and our regulatory bodies react to that. And I think the first way to do that would be to finally require the labeling of genetically engineered foods.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I'm sure our listeners agree too. Thank you so much, Colin O'Neal from EWG, for joining me to share some information. You can go to their website and download the app and find some great articles and educate yourself. We wanted to applaud Senators Debbie Stabenow, Jeff Merkley, John Tester, Barbara Boxer, and Pat Leahy for their efforts to defeat the DARK Act. And if you want to go to sendrocksnow.com, you can reward good behavior. Rocking Politics, I'm Hillary.